Ms. Ambassador, thank you so much for coming and for giving us this opportunity to share with us your views. We've been planning this interview for the US-Georgia diplomatic relations 30th anniversary, but we definitely need to start with the Ukraine issue, with the war in Ukraine. The next phase of Russian aggression in Ukraine, which is expected, and the US leaders, and not only of the US but some Western partners also like the UK Defense Minister, are indicating on Russia's next possible step to be chemical or biological weapon, not to mention more disastrous nuclear one. We know that Russia's been fueling a legend about certain biological threats from Ukraine and Georgia towards Russia, and one can easily identify the real threat. And the Kremlin is playing by the different set of rules, as you noted a couple of weeks ago at the Rondelli Foundation conference. What are the steps the West is able to make to avoid further, more catastrophic phase in the ongoing war in Ukraine?
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much for having me here today. And I want to start by expressing deep condolences to the families of all those who have died in this senseless, in this unprovoked war, including the Georgians who have died. This is a war that Putin chose to launch against his neighbor with no justification, targeting civilians, causing 10 million people to be displaced from their homes. I think the show of unity that we've seen from the world, not just the region, but the world, is the answer to Mr. Putin's aggressive use of force, brutal use of force against the Ukrainian people. The disinformation on biological laboratories is something that Russia has been trying to use here in Georgia for years. I think Georgians are very aware that this is simply not true. The attacks, for instance, against the Lugar Center, which is a research lab owned and managed by the Georgian government, has brought incredible promise to Georgia's public health sector. I can name the hepatitis C elimination program that has saved Georgian lives and is really a model for the whole world in terms of how to eliminate this deadly disease. But there's also the COVID-19 campaign that the National Centers for Disease Control and the United States Centers for Disease Control and Prevention work together on to help steer Georgia through the pandemic. The Lugar Center is also an important part of ensuring food safety and detecting threats of chemical and biological weapons use. So the narrative, once again, that Russia is trying to use here, has used here in Georgia and is trying to use elsewhere is just not true. It's a sign to me that they're still bringing these things out that have never caught on before. As to what the United States and others can do, we continue to send very clear messages that there will be a response should Russia choose again to escalate this. The United States and our allies and partners have been emphasizing the diplomatic solution to de-escalating and ending this war for months. And Mr. Putin has refused to take that path. That is the ultimate resolution of this. Putin will be defeated. He will be defeated through the unity of the United States and our allies and partners, not just in the region, but around the world.
But still, what will be the answer if those weapons are used by Russia?
Well, right now we are making it clear, we are trying to persuade Mr. Putin not to take those steps.
Okay.
Obviously, we're not going to disclose specifics at this point in time. We would like to ensure that Mr. Putin never gets to the point of using serious weapons like this. It is important to know that Russia is the only one with a chemical and biological weapons program. The United States doesn't have one, Georgia doesn't have one, Ukraine doesn't have one. It's only Russia that continues to threaten the world with a chemical and biological weapons program.
President Zelensky mentioned the point of ending the war, how to reach that point. He must be one of those persons who desire is the strongest, who wants to reach that point. And we know that Ukraine's NATO membership is not of a near future. And Zelensky noted that there are some NATO members who are ready to become guarantors for Ukraine's security, and a compromise may be reached to that direction. So where does the US government see that point of ending the war?
It's really up to the Ukrainian government to negotiate, and the people of Ukraine to negotiate the resolution of this conflict. Yeah. What they are willing to accept. So far, they've shown inspiring courage in their defense of not just their homeland, but of the principles that are at stake here, the freedom and liberty and independence. They are fighting in a remarkable way. They're able to fight that hard because of the support they're receiving from the United States, from NATO allies, and because they're a strong NATO partner. The outpouring of military assistance and humanitarian assistance is unprecedented in support of the Ukrainians who are defending their homeland. And part of that is because NATO is a political military alliance based on shared values. And Ukraine, Georgia, they have those same shared values. That's why they're valued partners of the alliance. That's why the United States has worked so hard over the years to support Ukraine's NATO aspiration, Georgia's NATO aspiration. There's a lot of hard work that has to be done, but I think if you look and see how far Georgia and Ukraine have come on their path, it is quite impressive. Now is the time for Georgia, for Ukraine to do what is necessary to be ready as a strong democracy, as a strong military, to make the commitment to enact the necessary reforms to meet the requirements of this political military alliance. This is a tremendous opportunity when there's a great deal of support for strong partners like Ukraine and Georgia.
To make it clearer, so the US does not see, in this case, Ukraine's NATO membership as a leverage to stop the war. And was it discussed at all, the issue of Ukraine's NATO membership as avoiding the war, like in December, for instance?
I'm not privy to those conversations. And again, I think it really is with President Zelensky, his cabinet, his people, to decide on choices like that, fundamental choices like that. But the United States remains a strong supporter of Ukraine's membership and of Georgia's NATO membership. That is why we have been working so hard with Georgia over many, many years to help Georgia meet the requirements of NATO membership, both militarily and, of course, in terms of democratic institutions.
We hear for the recent months about every inch of the NATO territory will be protected, this message from different US and NATO leaders. So where and in which circumstances does the counting of those inches start? Can we say exactly when it will be considered that NATO territory is touched by Russia?
I think you have the territory that is covered by those who are committed to the Washington Treaty. That's Obviously, alliance membership is something that is obtained and achieved once you meet all the criteria, both on the political side and the military side. Every single NATO ally has gone through a rigorous process of meeting those requirements. And that is to ensure that all those who sit at the North Atlantic Council table have the same strong shared values, the same strong commitment to democratic institutions, and the same military capabilities. That is how the alliance remains effective in defending NATO territory as well as NATO principles.
Tomorrow the US President is traveling to Europe, and on Thursday he will be taking part in the NATO Extraordinary Summit. The same day he will take part in G7 Summit, in the EU Summit also, all in one day. And by the way, it coincides with the US-Georgia diplomatic relations 30th anniversary. So there has no program or agenda published yet about the summit. Could you please tell us what may we expect from this summit?
This is a sign of the importance that the United States places on consultation with our allies and partners. As you see, he has a very full agenda, and that is designed to continue the close coordination that we have seen for months, since before the hostilities began. One of the reasons that the response to Putin's aggressive invasion of Ukraine has been so strong and so unified is because we have coordinated very closely with allies, partners, even sometimes countries that are not as close to us. And I think one of the best examples of that is at the UN, when 141 nations voted to condemn Russia's aggression, including Georgia. Georgia was a co-sponsor of the resolution. So this is, to me, a very clear message that the vast majority of the world does not support this kind of invasion of a sovereign nation. The vast majority of the world finds this unacceptable, to target civilians, to bomb cities, the kind of devastation that is being wrought, and sheer unprovoked use of force is simply unacceptable. There's too much at stake in terms of the principles and values and way of life that we have built over the past 30 years that have kept our economies growing, kept our countries more or less stable, kept our societies prospering. That's what's at stake here.
And first of all, people's lives.
Well, first and foremost.
Do you think the war in Ukraine made Georgia's and Ukraine's NATO perspective farther one? Put it in a farther future?
As I said, NATO is an alliance built on shared values, and both Ukraine and Georgia share those values, that commitment to freedom, that respect for human rights, for sovereignty and territorial integrity. A country like Georgia certainly knows that, having been invaded in 2008 and having 20% of the territory occupied by Russian forces. I think that this is, as I said, this is the time for a commitment to enacting the reforms that are necessary, to taking the steps to ensure that the military is as ready as it can be. And the United States stands with Georgia in working on those steps toward NATO membership. This is an incredible opportunity for Georgia, and there is no time to lose.
So I will ask in a different way the same question actually. Will, amid war in Ukraine, consensus among NATO allies be easier to reach than before the war?
I'm not at NATO headquarters, so I'm not sitting at the table for those discussions, but I can say again that I think people understand the vital importance of the unity that we're seeing here, and the unity comes from fighting for those shared values.
The sanctions issue. Sanctions against Russia and Georgia's position. On the very next day after Russia reinvaded Ukraine, Georgia's Prime Minister declared that Georgia is not going to take part in financial and economic sanctions against Russia, taking into consideration our national interests and the interests of our people. That's what he said. Later, ruling party's chairman, Irakli Kobakhidze, reiterated Georgia will not join sanctions against Russia. Then Mr. Garibashvili, during the visit of Polish counterpart, Mateusz Morawiecki, reminded his counterpart of the West not sanctioning Russia for waging the war of 2008 in Georgia, against Georgia, even Georgian government refraining from doing so. Last week I paid attention to your clarification on sanctions. So my question is, what does it mean exactly, Georgia complying with international sanctions regime, and what could be the consequences for the violation? What do you not want Georgian government to confuse? And if Georgia keeps its trade relations with Russia, it needs to use a banking system with Russia, some financial links also. So could you make more clarifications to that issue?
Well, I can say what we don't want to see is Georgia being used as a backdoor for companies or people to evade sanctions. That is something that we're watching very closely. I know there's a lot of confusion about what joining sanctions means or complying with sanctions. I think it's pretty straightforward. Georgia is complying with the international sanctions regimes. If Georgia wants to create its own bilateral sanctions against Russia, as it has done in the past, that is something for the Georgian government to decide. But so far, the Georgian government is complying with the sanctions regimes. Not all of the sanctions are going to impact Georgia. But of course, the most important thing is that Georgia is not being used to evade sanctions. And I don't think that that is going to happen. There's too many checks on monitoring this kind of activity. And obviously there are decisions for companies to make regarding the way they do business with Russia. There are also decisions for every country to make on what steps can we take to show our support for Ukraine, that is fighting so courageously and so valiantly against a much greater force, and what steps can we take to demonstrate, to send a very clear message to Putin and the Kremlin that an attack on our fundamental security principles will not be allowed to succeed.
So the sanctions issue and Georgia's positioning towards the war in Ukraine has actually exactly to do with its foreign policy, with its choice. In this context, we've been also following recently certain kind of confrontation between the president of Georgia and the government and the ruling party. President recently became remarkably active on the foreign stage, foreign arena, and now she's a target of kind of planned so-called sanctions from the Georgian Dream Party. So what should Georgia do to look more predictable, more consolidated on the international arena?
President Zurabishvili, I think, has done an excellent job of articulating exactly what Georgia should do. Georgia needs to unify. All of Georgia's political leaders, all of Georgia's population need to unify in the face of this aggression by Russia in support of Ukraine. The President Zurabishvili has been working earnestly on behalf of Georgia's best interests, both in the international scene and here domestically as well. I thought her message to call for unity was was very well said and very timely. Georgia doesn't have time to continue this infighting. This is a moment when Georgia needs to come together. And I have seen Georgia's political leaders work together. I know they can do it.
When?
Because
last spring, you mean?
During the negotiations that led up to the April 19th agreement. The April 19th agreement itself showed that they could agree on a roadmap. Now, in the end, for reasons on both sides, they walked away from that agreement, but 129 out of 150 members of parliament signed on to the April 19th agreement, signed on to those reforms. That, to me, shows there is agreement on what Georgia needs to do as the way forward. And I think this is the opportunity to come together in support of Ukraine, but also in support of Georgia's best interests, putting this polarization that has so deeply divided this country. Only Russia benefits when Georgians are divided. This is a time for unity.
So you think that Georgian politicians should go back to the, as we call it, Charles Michel's agreement?
They don't have to call it the April 19th
Anything.
Or the Charles Michel. The reforms are there. They are still the reforms that Georgia needs to do. They're the reforms Georgia needs to do for its EU membership application. They're the reforms they need to do for its NATO application. So if Georgia is serious about joining the EU and joining NATO, this is the roadmap to get there. And everywhere I go, traveling around the regions, which I love to do, it's my favorite part of the job, I hear from people that they want this Euro-Atlantic future. I hear them say that Europe is Georgia's future. They see Russia as the past, and a past of broken promises as well. Over 75% of Georgian population wants to be a member wants Georgia to be a member of NATO. Over 80% want Georgia to be a member of the European Union. This has been consistent for years and years. It's a very strong showing of public commitment to this future.
What exactly the time ahead should be used by Georgia for the successful process of the EU integration?
The first step
Since we've already filed an application for
yes, and
candidates.
that's a huge opportunity for Georgia, but it's also very ambitious and going to be a great deal of work. The first step would be getting I would say a joint task force that's inclusive, that is all the political leaders, that is civil society, that are media representatives, that are the local government, so that this process is one that is owned and driven by the people of Georgia. There is a lot of work that has to go into this, and there's no time to lose on this, especially now that it's been moved, the timeline has been moved up. But it's a wonderful opportunity for Georgia, and another reason for Georgia to unite and put aside these differences that have been just so divisive and polarizing to the country.
As for the reforms, what are the main challenges on the way of implementing reforms? What do you see?
So far, what we've seen is we need more political will. We need more follow-through. There needs to be a focus on what is really critical for Georgia's democratic progress, and maybe less energy spent on attacking each other and calling each other names and trying to create more division and fear and confusion in the society. I think the people of Georgia are tired of this. In fact, we've seen in different polls, the people of Georgia want their political representatives to be working together in Parliament. That's where they should be. There is so much work to do. And I know that there are many members of Parliament who are ready to do that. They are ready to get to work. And they're ready to get to work with each other. So I think the European Union membership application is a very good vehicle for bringing political leaders together as well as others and showing the people of Georgia that they are committed to working for Georgia's future, its Euro-Atlantic future, and its best interests.
Yeah, that vehicle needs fuel all the time for its engine to work. So we all witness activation of Russian propaganda and disinformation in Georgia, inside Georgia also, all over the world, but inside Georgia too. And activation of pro-Russian groups, even being openly aggressive and threatening certain socially active figures like Samira Bayramova of Marneuli region. You and the Western diplomats are also targets of the aggressive rhetoric, like the one that followed last year of your statement on another wave of appointment judges. So one of the leaders of Altinfo, then Altinfo leader, Zurab Maharadze, said, we will form the situation the way the US embassy would never ever pretend to express its position, and the ambassador will only be busy with visas, cultural exchange, and different programs. Our goal is to decolonize Georgia. What could be, how serious is this challenge for Georgia? And what could be an effective instrument against Russian propaganda, and not just a propaganda anymore, as we've seen since last summer events?
I don't want to give these people more credit than their due.
I understand that, but still.
But I agree with you. These are these are people who advocate violence. These are people who have a outwardly pro-Russian message, calling for Russian troops here, calling for Russian bases here, in some cases potentially setting things up for the justification of a Russian invasion. I mean, these are not people who are working in Georgia's best interests. These are the instruments of pro-Russian disinformation that Georgia has seen for years. And I think it's a very worrying trend to see this get any kind of traction at all, and certainly to see them use violence against peaceful people expressing their freedom of expression. This is contrary to Georgian principles and Georgia's constitution. So other countries have and businesses have taken these pro-violence programming off the air because they are advocating violence and hate in some cases. I think the answer to that is trying to help the population understand what they're hearing, understand the threat that this represents. The United States Embassy does a lot of work on media literacy, trying to help young people as well as adults better identify fake news, better read through narratives that are not true and are designed to create confusion.
Like neutrality?
And division. Excuse me?
Like neutrality issue? One of the Russian narratives is that if Georgia chooses a neutrality path and refuses NATO perspective, then Georgia will be happy and there will be no further aggression from Russia in the future.
Well, I think the Georgian people have said repeatedly what they want, and what they want is a Euro-Atlantic future. What they want is more Western integration into the European family of nations. I also think Georgia's history shows that agreements with Russia rarely hold. Throughout history, there have been many cases where Russia has broken its promises to Georgia, the most recent being 2008. We are all still waiting for Russia to fulfill its obligations under the 2008 ceasefire agreement, including withdrawing its forces from Abkhazia and Tskhinvali. So I think Georgians will probably be very careful in making any kind of arrangements like that.
And to continue with Georgia-U.S. partnership, the impact of the war in Ukraine, we call it the war in Ukraine, but it's a global catastrophe. And will it change U.S.-Georgia bilateral agenda or time frame, like priorities, like in security sphere, in economic relations, like making possible free trade agreement between the U.S. and Georgia, things like that, to have more integration between each other?
Georgia's priorities, foreign policy priorities, are very clear. There needs to be more political will and more follow-through, as I mentioned earlier, to continue the progress that we've already seen on that path. And the United States has been with Georgia along that path for 30 years. As you mentioned, on March 24th, we are marking the 30th anniversary of our diplomatic relations, and we're very, very proud of the progress that Georgia has made, the achievements that Georgia and the United States have made together over those years. It's a very broad and deep partnership. We have over 30 different agencies and offices at the U.S. Embassy working with Georgia on key areas: economic growth and diversifying the economy, building strong democratic institutions, and strengthening Georgia's security cooperation. These are a wide array of projects. I think on the markets in particular, we were talking earlier about Georgia's relationship with Russia. Many of our programs have helped Georgia become less dependent on Russia, finding new markets. In 2019, when Russia shut down flights from Russia to Georgia, Georgia made up for the difference with tourists coming in, more tourists coming in from Europe, from America, from the Gulf states, from the UK, Japan, and these are tourists who pay, who spend more money when they come to Georgia. So it's really many different opportunities that Georgia has. We also have a USAID program we launched last year, a $7 million program to help Georgia with its energy security, so that Georgia is less dependent on Russia and other countries and develops its own renewable energy resources. So we have a lot of different areas where we are working. We have good partners in our Georgian partners to strengthen the economy, to build those democratic institutions, and to help Georgia be prepared to defend its land and sea borders through a stronger Georgian Defense Force, through a stronger Coast Guard, through border police and law enforcement. So we are very proud of what the United States and Georgia have accomplished over the last 30 years, and we're very excited about what's yet to come.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.